Alrighty. I thought this would be an interesting article to look through, given some of the commentary and things going on of the day. It's an article from 2021 in Social Psychological and Personality Science. Disliked but free to speak. Cognitive ability is related to supporting freedom of speech for groups across the ideological spectrum. It's review night. Let's get moving. Alrighty, I'm sorry I've been away for a while with the reviews. It's been quite busy, both personally and professionally, so it's been very difficult with lots of things going on to sit down and have the time to read and review some of these articles that come across my desk. But there's a few that have come across recently, and this one was sent my way, and I thought it would be a good one to get back into because there's some interesting things in here and some interesting questions I would have related to this particular article. It's certainly an interesting article from what I've read here so far, and I do have some my usual questions kind of things going on here. Abstract first, as always. Freedom of speech for all citizens is often considered a cornerstone of democratic societies. In 3 studies, we examined the relationship between cognitive ability and support for freedom of speech for a variety of social groups across the ideological spectrum, and varies between, number being, 1,300 and change to 18,000 and change, rather, in the first thing. So three different studies that they did there, numbers there, corroborating our theoretical expectations, although cognitive ability was related to more effective prejudice toward relatively conservative groups and less effective prejudice toward relatively liberal groups. People with higher levels of cognitive ability were more in favor of freedom of speech for all target groups. The relationship between cognitive ability and freedom of speech was mediated by intellectual humility, pre-registered study 3. The results indicate that cognitive ability contributes to the support for the democratic right of freedom of speech for all social ideological groups. So, cognitive ability. There. It does, the way they defined it, I might actually consider it more of an education level than anything, rather than the cognitive ability, and I'll show you that in a second. But I'd welcome some discussion on that here. So, but there's some interesting commentary that I would note straight out of the gate with the introduction. Present series of studies investigate the support for freedom of speech, a fundamental right in democratic societies that is protected by national U.S. Constitutional Amendment 1 and international law, United Nations General Assembly, 1948. Problem is that international law is not really binding anywhere. If you're a sovereign country and you don't want to respect the freedom of speech, that's too bad. I mean, international law is pretty toothless for the most part. However, calling upon freedom of speech rights can be used strategically, such as when there is tension between protecting freedom of speech and protecting people from prejudiced discourse. What the hell is prejudiced discourse is my question there, because I'm sorry, there's really just discourse. Whether it has somebody's prejudices involved is a other question, but it's really just discourse. It's like I said, I like what Christian Watson said the other day on Twitter. It was really fascinating when he was talking about there's no such thing as misinformation or disinformation. There's just information, really. And I would say the same thing here. There's just discourse and the associated information you get in discourse. In the context of hate speech, what is hate speech? Because at least to the best of my knowledge, hate speech is not something that is legally defined in the United States. It does not fall under a legal statute anywhere. And for a very good reason. If you start defining certain things as hate speech that you can't say them, you start running afoul of the First Amendment. So that's what I'm kind of wondering, huh? What is defined as hate speech here? Rousseau and Dovidio, I apologize if I mispronounced your names, showed that people holding anti-black bias were more likely to consider hurtful acts targeting black people as protected by free speech rights. Anti-black bias. Define that, because if it's in the woke sense, that can be just about anything, to be honest. Let's see. Similarly, White and Crandall demonstrated that racial prejudice is a reliable predictor of the free speech defense of racist expression, but not of free speech in general. Oh boy. As such, recent research on freedom of speech support has often focused on group specific reasons and beliefs about whether freedom of speech of particular groups should be promoted or curbed. However, in the present research, we aim for a broader perspective by examining cognitive ability as a general predictor of support for freedom of speech for a wide variety of social groups. Okay, racial prejudice is a reliable predictor of the free speech defense of racist expression. Interesting. I might have to go look at that study to satisfy my curiosity about it. Um, and I have to ask the question given when this study was done and when this study was done also, whether or not that is meant in the sense of the Western Enlightenment tradition of racial prejudice being, I clearly think one race being that a person rather thinks one race is better or worse than another, um rather than the sort of baked in the cake kind of strange nonsense that there is with the postmodernist woke version that comes with critical theory and the like. um if you see me looking off camera, there's a window over here and I have two little cats that are that are fun little terrors sometimes, so they may make an appearance, they may not. um let's see. Cognitive ability has been demonstrated to play an important role in a range of social phenomena, including social judgments. Notably, a recent meta-analysis by Honorat et al. That's not really recent. I mean, that's 7 years ago now. Spanning more than 60 years of empirical research, revealed negative association between cognitive ability and prejudice. Okay, so like more cognitive ability, less prejudice is what you're talking about there with that negative relationship. Anyway, however, using a large representative US sample, Brandt and Crawford demonstrated that higher cognitive ability was indeed related to less effective prejudice toward the traditional studied groups, replicating the meta-analytic results of that, but also more effective prejudice toward conservative groups like Christian fundamentalists and the military, leading them to conclude that people with both relatively higher and lower levels of cognitive ability show approximately equal levels of intergroup bias toward different sets of groups. So what they're saying here is that in one study you found this and one study you found that. So this is the reason they want to do the study again, because they got to figure out, what's actually correct here. And interesting because it's higher cognitive ability resulted in more effective prejudice toward conservative groups, like Christian fundamentalists in the military. Never heard of the military being entirely conservative, or a conservative group, to be honest. That seems strange to me to stick the military as a conservative group. Particularly nowadays. I don't think necessarily the military, at least the higher level brass of the military, might be much more liberal compared to folks who are on the ground every day doing the day-to-day work in the military. Anyway, findings raise the question about how cognitive ability is related to support for freedom of speech for groups across the ideological spectrum. Does this relationship mimic the group-dependent relationship between cognitive ability and effective prejudice, or is the cognitive ability associated with support for freedom of speech across the ideological spectrum, even for disliked ideological groups? We expect the latter to be true. Indeed, although people with higher versus lower cognitive abilities may relatively dislike certain conservative groups, we argue that they are also more appreciative of the virtues of open debates with a free flow of information, divergent ideas, and criticism to foster knowledge and informed decision making. So they think in the study, as they're starting, they're pretty much along the lines of agreeing with that Brandt and Crawford study, where they think cognitive ability an increase in cognitive ability tends to increase your support for freedom of speech for liberal groups, and yes, conservative groups, but not as much, not as likely to say that conservative groups should have freedom of speech. That's the kind of gist that they're getting into it, and arguing that because, that some are more appreciative, people with higher cognitive ability are more appreciative of the virtues with open debate, and so they'll be game for freedom of speech anyway. That depends on how you define cognitive ability, I would think. Okay. As a key hypothesis of this research, we expected a positive association between cognitive ability and tolerance toward all groups, both relatively liberal and conservative, to express and disseminate their ideas in society. Okay, so how did they get this? How did they do this? 21 waves of data from the General Social Survey. The General Social Survey has been given out and taken by members of the public since 1974. Since 1972, actually. They just focused on 74 to 2018. Why? I don't know. But that's what it is there. It kind of recently celebrated 50-year birthday here. So it is still running, actually. I just noticed when it flipped over to the website, the 2021 data is there now. And this is used a lot in survey studies, I've noticed, where you just want to look at the data, because the GSS is nice in that it's a lot of data on American opinions over time. And it's particularly because it's only run in the U.S. It's a lot of opinions on Americans over a very, very long time. So you can track a lot of shifts in things. Although I would question one thing, because if it's the same question always, the challenge that you'll have is how is the definition of word changed over time? Like, we're dealing with the issues with postmodernist versus Enlightenment right now, or as I might be inclined to refer to it, the more Marxist version of looking at the world versus the Western version of looking at the world, which, goodness, or the critical theory version of looking at the world versus the Enlightenment tradition, rationalist tradition. There's a lot of differences there in how those things are discussed. And so that's actually kind of important to get at. For cognitive ability, so they did this with 3 studies. And there's always a question mark I have with these kinds of things, and it's a fair question to ask that you can go back and ask of any social study, is, how can you be sure that your things compare across the how can you be sure it compares across the different studies that you're doing here, that you're putting it together, that you can make reasonable and robust conclusions with 3 different studies all rammed in together? And that has to do with the methods, really, because if the methods are consistent across the studies, you should be able to get something similar results across these 3 studies that they're doing, and indeed they did. Though I do want to point out something, because I'm sorry, there's one group they identified in here called politically conservative that I'm just like, no, particularly not in the not in that time period early on in the survey. I definitely would never have called them conservative. In all retained waves of the GSS, a vocabulary test was used as a measure of cognitive ability. In the test, they're presented with 10 words. Each target word is accompanied by a list of 5 words. Participants are instructed to select a word from the list with meaning closest to the target word. Okay, since it has repeatedly been demonstrated that vocabulary knowledge is highly related to general intelligence, many investigations, including Brandon Crawford's study that advanced the effective bias symmetry hypothesis, have used the number of correct answers on the specific test as a proxy for cognitive ability or intelligence. So this first study is just basically cognitive ability is your vocabulary. I don't know that I necessarily agree that that is a great measure of your cognitive ability and intelligence, because you could be great at memorizing words and what different words are connected to others and how they relate to each other, and still be an idiot at the same time. So, I don't know about that. Okay, freedom of speech. We identified 3 types of questions in the GSS that tap attitudes toward freedom of speech for 7 different social groups. Participants were presented with these social groups and were asked, for each social group, A, whether or not a member of the social group should be allowed to speak in the participants' community, whether or not the member of this social group should be allowed to teach in a college or university, and C, whether or not a book that favors the ideas of the social group should be allowed in the library. For the waves that also included measure cognitive ability, the following social groups were included in the GSS. 2 groups that are generally perceived as politically conservative, racist. That's where I want to stop. I'm going to call that right there. That is not necessarily accurate to tag racist as being politically conservative. And particularly as you're moving forward into that time period where you're dealing with the transition with the postmodernist nonsense, and some of it which is blatantly racist itself, and that is on the left, not the right. No. Goodness. And, I'm sorry, conservatism as an ideology, generally speaking, doesn't support the collectivist notions that underlie racism. The racial essentialism that allows racism to begin with is not something that's generally supported in conservatism or libertarianism as an ideology. Why? Because you don't look at people as groups. You look at them as individuals. And to add another thing on the history side there, um, it wasn't the political right that was, I don't know, founding the KKK and all these kinds of things. That was the political left in the US that did that. So that's why I'm just like, that one doesn't make any sense to me. And somebody has a misunderstanding of what it means to be politically conservative. I think to put those groups in there. I don't necessarily have a problem with them talking about this particular group, because generally this is a group of people that, if you're racist, particularly in the Enlightenment sense, you're horribly disliked. One of the worst things in the US to be called. But that's not correct to lump that in as politically conservative. That's not correct in the slightest. Okay. And I don't know how that was figured out that way, to be honest. They didn't really give a whole lot of thing here as to why they assigned these the particular way that they did. And what they're after with this is, how much participants would support other members of these targeted groups being able to speak freely. Freedom of speech, if you will. And that's where it gets interesting for me. So let's go on for the next thing here. We'll finish that and we'll come back up to the table. And militarists, and 4 groups that were generally perceived as politically liberal: homosexuals, socialists, anti-religionists, and communists. And finally, 6 waves between 2008 and 2018 included Muslim clergymen who preached hate of the United States. Okay, so this is a table of actual results they have up here. And one of the things I want to point out here with the table, because it says a lot just with this, is that what they did was a linear mixed model, if you will, that looked at a lot of these interactions and relationships with these different kinds of things. And the log odds ratio here is this OR thing, and that's the measure that's using it. And the way they talk about it in here is that in the log odds ratio, the idea is if the ratio number there is less than 1, then when you have cognitive ability go up of the participants, then the support for the free speech of the target group goes down. On the other hand, if the OR there, the odds ratio value, is greater than 1, as cognitive ability goes up, the support for freedom of speech for a particular group goes up also. So that is the general thing there. And what you'll notice, and this is the point that they're going to make all the way throughout, which is great, actually. I'm actually really, really pleased to see this in terms of supporting freedom of speech in the country. I would actually love to see how these numbers, well, actually, they do have that for the thing here. In a figure, I'll get to that in a second. But you can actually see this here. The numbers are always greater than 1, allowing people to speak, allowing books in the library, allowing folks to teach. So as a person's cognitive ability goes up, just general intelligence, what they're talking about here is that, okay, yeah, I'm fine. I have more support for you speaking, even if I really dislike you. Which is to say, there was probably a lot of things in this group that were disliked over that period that we're talking about. Remember, we're talking about 1974 to 2018. And there was a lot of changes in there. Including what gets defined as, how certain things get defined at this point. But like I said, I don't necessarily agree with some of the classifications that they put in the text about a target group being one thing or another, because what I have to say with this is that you just racist could be a racist in the first group. There could be politically liberal or politically conservative, to be honest. Same thing for anybody who's gay. You could be politically conservative or you could be politically liberal. Either one. Those kinds of things. So I don't necessarily think it was the right thing to do here because there's such a variability in a human population of their political beliefs and worldview that trying to say that one particular group of people is typically politically liberal or typically politically conservative is really, really shoddy here, particularly when I didn't see a real strong justification. Yeah, they didn't give any justification here for why they grouped them that way in the text, or why they said that. So that's why I'm just like, I don't necessarily think so. Of lumping some groups in as politically conservative or politically liberal here. So, with the exception of two, because I think socialists and communists are definitely more on the left than they are on the right. I don't think I've ever met a conservative communist before. But then again, you never know some days of what people claim to be. So that's what I wanted to point out here is actually, so these are all positive. That's great. The other thing here is the figure, which also illustrates that. So this is basically something that I was after is, cognitive, this odds ratio kind of thing. How much does it change over time? Actually. And so this is for respecting with support for militaristic people to speak versus anti-religionists for people to speak. And so going this way here, you got it pretty steady, both of them all the way through. I would actually like to see what was shown here for other groups that they had in the target for the first study. That would have been much more interesting to see. But makes a great point here, actually, what they did with it, that in this case, that odds ratio is always above 1 since the 1970s here. And that's actually really great to see in here. There's a lot of variability, which of course you'd expect because of people, but it never goes below 1, which is great to see. You're still supporting free speech, even if you dislike that group that you're allowing to speak. Let's put it that way. So I appreciate this immensely. So let's see. The second study here is a little bit different. They kept the target groups thing, changed a bunch of them around here, which I'm kind of glad they did that, because I don't think that targeted groups in the first one quite fit to anything. And I wouldn't like I said, I wouldn't necessarily group a bunch of these as politically conservative or politically liberal. Given that the GSS includes a greater number of presumably relatively liberal groups than conservative groups, in quotes there, we conducted a second study to examine the association between cognitive ability and freedom of speech with a more balanced set of social groups, adding the conservative groups for which Brandt and Crawford reported the strongest associations between cognitive ability and effective prejudice, which is what they reported earlier, was talked about in the introduction earlier. Apparently, with these groups in that prior study, cognitive ability went up, and there was more effective prejudice towards these other groups, the Christian fundamentalists, the members of big business industry, and the Tea Party. In here. Additionally, we included measures of effective prejudice to confirm Brandt and Crawford's observation that a cognitive ability is related to more prejudice toward conservative groups and less prejudice towards liberal groups in here. So, in other words, they're saying there's more prejudice toward these, much more toward these conservative groups. Again, I think they do have flaws in that Christian fundamentalists are not necessarily all conservative, and I definitely would not call members of big business all conservative at this point. Particularly in the last 20 years, I would not say that. So that's a question mark there. I don't know that I would necessarily call them conservative. Or perceived conservative groups or what have you. Hi, little one. So that's a note that I would make on that particular case. Let's see. After completion of demographic variables in the same measure of cognitive ability as in study 1, which is the vocabulary test, participants were presented with the following social groups: racist, Christian fundamentalists, people who belong to a big business industry, members of the Tea Party, militarists, socialists, homosexuals, anti-religionists, communists, and anti-American Muslim clergymen. Each social group was accompanied by the following description and questions adapted from the GSS. There are always some people whose ideas are not shared by other people. For example, a social group with very outspoken ideas if such a person wanted to, yeah, okay. All questions were answered on a 5-point Likert type scale. And for each social group, responses were combined into an internally consistent scale. See table 2. Next, we also measured effective prejudice using Brandt and Crawford's procedure. Participants rated the 10 social groups on feeling thermometers ranging from 0 to 0, which is unfavorable and cold, to 100, favorable and warm. Similar to Brandt and Crawford's, responses were recoded so that higher scores indicated more effective prejudice. Therefore, participants were again presented with social groups and were asked to indicate how they perceive overall ideological position of each social group on a 7-point Likert scale. Okay. Finally, participants were asked for their own ideological position. Verbatim questions, correlations. Okay. So yeah. So a lot of these groups are subject to more effective prejudice and have an ideological position. So like 1 to 7 is more conservative, less conservative, kind of thing. And their own ideological position, one of the things they asked, was what do they perceive the ideological position of each group to be here, which some of these numbers I would love to know how they changed over time, to be honest, to actually see them. But we shall see here. We shall see with that one. I don't know how they changed over time. That would be something I would actually love to see them show that, because I think they did do that to obtain Amazon mechanical. 300 U.S. citizens whose native language. Okay, so this is not based on the GSS. This is based on something that is much more recent, actually, because it's the Amazon mechanical Turk. So it couldn't have been the GSS, because a bunch of the GSS, of course, was administered when computers were not really a thing. Okay. 80% identified. Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. That's very interesting. That's very interesting indeed. Excuse me. So let's see. As reported in Table 2, perceptions of social groups included in our study ranged from strongly liberal to strongly conservative. So this is the perception there of the social group itself. Given that it was when it was, and some of the things going on now, this number may actually, a bunch of these numbers actually do make sense to me. Let's see. Cognitive ability was associated with less effective prejudice towards social groups that are perceived as liberal, whereas cognitive ability was associated with more effective prejudice toward groups that are perceived as conservative, if they're perceived as conservative. And again, I would ask how some of these numbers have changed over time, because this is a much more recent than what was in the GSS. Here, so yeah, I would imagine some of these have changed in their meaning, very much so, as well as their perception of them. So, like, this is correlation here, cognitive ability, prejudice. One thing I want to point out, though, even though some of these are significant, there's a bunch of them that are not. A bunch of these are not statistically significant at all in their relationships between cognitive ability and prejudice. And that's a good, that says to me that there's potentially a lot of confounding factors with respect to this particular study. Cognitive ability and freedom of speech, same kind of thing, actually. And there's the relationship here is not significant, statistically significant in most cases. Here, I think with these, I think if, depending on the, if it's a 95% confidence interval, then these are just barely significant, and these two here are just barely significant, but these two right here in the middle actually are not significant at all. These two right here, from cognitive ability to prejudice. So that's interesting by itself. But you gotta notice all these correlations here that they have are very, very weak. They're very, very weak, actually. getting something that's not, you don't get into something that's like 0.34 or 0.34 or anything like that, which is like a third, um, until you get over here. So a lot of these are really, really tiny, which means the relationship may be significant, but it's not that strong. It's not that strong in terms of defining what it has to do with cognitive ability, and that just has to do with your worldview and what kind of culture you were raised in, necessarily, if you think freedom of speech is a thing or not, and whether or not somebody should be allowed to speak, or even support their ability to speak. So, I suspect this is not necessarily cognitive ability, and not necessarily political ideology of your own as a participant, as much as it may be just your worldview and where did you grow up in the culture, what culture did you grow up in, that you have support for it. Notably, cognitive ability was not significantly related to effective prejudice toward social groups who receive the highest level of effective prejudice in general, while also being perceived as not particularly liberal or conservative. Communists, Muslims, clergymen, yeah. Okay, I'm glad they acknowledged that here. I'm really glad that they acknowledged that here, is that the perception here is that those groups are not particularly being perceived as particularly liberal or particularly conservative. I'm surprised that communists got lumped into that with the numbers here, but I'm glad that they admitted that here. I wish they had admitted that earlier on, because they gave the presumption from the GSS that one particular group is part of conservatives and they're not. So that's a point I would make, but that's fascinating right there. Let's see. More importantly, and similar to study 1, cognitive ability was positively related to supporting the freedom of speech for each social group. Again, that continues. All of these are positive and actually statistically significant if you're using a 0.05 threshold for significance. They would all be significant. These less so than the others for what people perceive as much more liberal groups. Okay. So let me think here. They did 1 to 7. Oh, I see what's going on here. They gave a roughly. Okay. I could see that. I would love to see if these are statistically significantly different given the standard deviations of these things from the middle number, which is 4. The middle number is 4. So are they statistically significant? Does that mean statistically significantly different from 4? I would guess not, because the standard deviation is as large as it is. But that might be a test I can run and show my locals folks the results of that. Most importantly, and similarly to study 1, okay, additional, although there were positive relations between cognitive ability and freedom of speech were found for all groups, it may be interesting to explore whether the perceived ideology of the groups affected the magnitude of the relationships under study. Results revealed in addition to the effect of cognitive ability and perceived ideology of the target group, is small but significant interaction. So yeah, an interaction relationship has to do with if you have cognitive ability and you know you have a perception of the ideology. How does that affect that? More pronounced for liberal groups compared to conservative groups. So again, supporting the idea that if you have a higher cognitive ability, you perceive the your target group in question to be more liberal, then you seem to be more likely to support their freedom to speak, compared to ones that you think are more conservative. Analysis revealed that cognitive ability and the participants' ideology did not interact on supporting freedom of speech. So that is simply to say, in conclusion, what mattered when supporting a person's freedom to speak was not the participant's own ideology, very liberal to very conservative. It was the target, the perception of the target as to whether or not you'd support them. But everybody got positive support at the same time. It's just that somebody was a little bit less than others. But I'd still support the right to speak, which is great. That's actually pretty kind of great news when you think about it, right? The last one here is their last particular study. Study 2 showed that although higher cognitive ability is related to less effective prejudice toward liberal groups and more effective prejudice toward conservative groups, corroborating Brent and Crawford, cognitive ability was related to supporting freedom of speech for all included social groups, thereby replicating the findings from Study 1. We also tested whether the association between cognitive ability and freedom of speech support are mediated by intellectual humility, IH. A note point here, and this is a question I would ask, of course, the authors of this, is instead of the cognitive test here, and they did this again by the MTurk, the Amazon Mechanical Turk, so this is a bit more recent than the GSS data. After responding to demographic questions, participants completed a verbal cognitive ability measure, that is the Ammons Quick Test. Participants are presented with 4 pictures and 50 words and is instructed to assign each word to one of the pictures. Finally, participants indicated their political position on a 7-point Likert scale, from very liberal to very conservative. Again, those kinds of things. So in this case, they don't look at the target's ideology again. They do collect the participants' ideology information by their own admission, which is a little different, but still, very good kind of thing. Very, very good. Yes. Pre-register the following 2 hypotheses. Cognitive abilities positively, dang it, related to supporting freedom of speech for all included target groups. Hypothesis 2, the predicted positive association between cognitive ability and supporting freedom of speech is mediated by intellectual humility. So those are your 2 hypotheses in this final thing. Attitudes towards supporting freedom of speech for each target group were examined with a path model that on the observed scores in which cognitive ability was included as an independent variable and IH as a mediator. Studies 1 and 2 for all target groups, a significant positive association emerged between cognitive ability and support for freedom of speech. Moreover, each association between cognitive ability and supporting free speech was significantly mediated by the intellectual humility. So, these are the kind of major things here. And this is just like general support kind of thing, and this is where you can see it here. Yes, it generally suggests that there is more support for freedom of speech with increasing cognitive ability. That's the one thing. What they're talking about with the intellectual humility is in this column over here, where in these 2 columns, actually, both directly and indirectly. And the idea here is that, okay, this positive kind of thing means there's a relationship between more intellectual humility and increased support for freedom of speech for these particular groups. And that's actually fine with me on that one. I think. I'm just thinking, is there anything I should know about that I missed from the methods? Might be relevant here. No, I don't think so. Okay. Always go back and double check. Sometimes I find something that I missed the first time I read through it. Based on the correlation pattern between cognitive ability and the facet scales of IH previously revealed in Zimigrod. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. We expected that, especially, quote, openness to revising one's viewpoint and, quote, respect for others' viewpoints would mediate the relationship between cognitive ability and support for free speech. Let's see. In addition to the effect of cognitive ability and target group's ideology on supporting freedom of speech, a small but significant interaction indicated that the association between cognitive ability and supporting freedom of speech was more pronounced for relatively liberal target groups compared to conservative groups. Again, how are you defining this? Because this time you're not defining it based on the perception that the participants have. You might be defining it based on your own thing, which, like I said before, I think you have a misunderstanding of what conservatism is. Indicated that the association between cognitive ability and supporting freedom of speech was more pronounced for relatively liberal target groups compared to conservative groups. Second, cognitive ability and participants' ideology did not interact on support for freedom of speech. So again, your own ideology as a participant, as a person, doesn't matter as much as what you think the other person's ideology is in terms of whether or not you support their free speech. And generally what they find is everybody in the US tends to support a person's right to speak freely. This is interesting given the amount of cancel culture that we have currently. As I'm thinking about it in terms of what's going on currently, what about cancel culture with all this? Because I kind of wonder, do people really support free speech if the thing is that you're okay with people getting canceled? Hmm? We examine the relationship between cognitive ability and attitudes toward a cornerstone of democratic societies, the freedom of speech for every citizen, irrespective of his or her ideological attitudes and beliefs. Data from the GSS and 2 additional studies showed that cognitive ability is positively related to more support for freedom of speech for social groups across the ideological spectrum. Hence, individuals with higher cognitive abilities also advocate freedom of speech for the groups they dislike. In line with our theorizing, the pre-registered third study revealed that associations are mediated by IH, intellectual humility. Let's see. By identifying cognitive ability as a general predictor of free speech support across a wide array of ideological target groups, present research complements previous work that identified specific mechanisms underlying free speech support towards specific outgroups. For example, Rosales and Dovito demonstrated that application of free speech rights might in some circumstances be used as a strategic means to permit the expression of prejudice in society. Okay, that touches on, like I said, with science. I've said this many times with science. Science cannot give you a moral compass. That is not what it's designed to do. As a process by which we get at the truth, it is not designed to give you a moral compass. Again, expression of prejudice in society. I'm presuming that's what they mean by prejudice discourse earlier on. Remember that? This is where I give an opinion, and others might disagree with me. If you say it and it's disgusting, yeah, I'm going to say that I disagree, and here's why I disagree. And I may very well call you for the ugliness that you've put forward. That is disgusting phrasing and important, but you still have a right to say it. You still have your freedom to believe that, even if I think your beliefs are abhorrent, and I won't stop you from saying it. That doesn't mean I won't speak up and say something against it, but you can say it all you want. That's kind of where I'm at with that. And I do wonder with that kind of phrasing, is this the kind of thing that the application of free speech rights might in some circumstances be used as a strategic means to permit the expression of prejudice in society? Here's a question and thought that's been on my mind. If you say outlaw all prejudicial discourse, if you will, violation of the First Amendment right away. The problem with that is likely that just because you've outlawed it doesn't mean that prejudice goes away. I mean, somebody will still believe it. But you just drive it underground a lot of times. Or at least I would think that's what you end up doing, is you just end up driving it underground so that people, you never learn how prejudiced people are necessarily, and you can never help them realize that that's a bad prejudice to have. So that's another reason, actually, in the name of trying to get rid of stereotypes that are inaccurate and really nasty, then I would not necessarily say you want to stop the expression of it, because you're just going to force it underground, and it's still going to be there in nasty fashion. Such target-specific mechanisms may explain why the association between cognitive ability and freedom of speech support for relatively liberal groups was somewhat more pronounced than for relatively conservative groups. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a line. Indeed, in addition to cognitive ability as a general predictor of supporting free speech, specific mechanisms can additionally underlie free speech support for particular target groups. Such target-specific mechanisms may explain why the association between cognitive ability and freedom of speech support for relatively liberal groups was somewhat more pronounced than for relatively conservative groups. As target groups may differ on many specific characteristics, such as the extent to which they are perceived to be marginalized or disseminate hate in society. Again, what is hate? This has changed a lot, this particular phrase, in the last couple of years. So what the heck do you mean by hate? The consideration of both general specific and target group specific mechanisms seems warranted for a more complete understanding of why and when people support freedom of speech. The present contribution does not invalidate Brandon Crawford's observation that cognitive ability is related to more effective prejudice toward relatively conservative groups and less effective prejudice toward relatively liberal groups. Indeed, with their definition of what is meant by conservative and liberal, by the way. Like I said, I think they have there's distinctly some challenges with the understanding of what conservatism is in a lot of ways. However, the present research provides a more detailed perspective on the relationship between cognitive ability and attitudes towards social groups, demonstrating that such a mirrored pattern of relationships between cognitive ability and effective prejudice toward target groups across the ideological spectrum cannot be generalized to attitudes about fundamental democratic rights to freedom of speech. Very nice. Very nice. I kind of agree with that, actually. Between cognitive ability and attitudes, demonstrating the mirrored pattern of relationships between cognitive ability and effective prejudice toward targeted groups across the ideological spectrum cannot be generalized. Indeed. There's I think a whole bunch of things that got left out. Like I said, a lot of those correlations when they were doing that were really low. Really low. May have been significant, but they were really, really low. We believe that the present results are especially compelling because the positive relationship between cognitive ability and freedom of speech support for both relatively liberal and conservative groups was consistently found in representative samples covering a period of more than 40 years, as well as in additional new samples, including a wide variety of target groups and with 2 different measures of cognitive ability. Hence, although rather strongly formulated, the famous words of Evelyn Beatrice Hall in The Friends of Voltaire, 1906, seems to represent a philosophy particularly embraced among individuals with higher cognitive abilities. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Indeed. And I'm really pleased that that's the case. Some of these numbers, though, and I think this is more, I think my general thoughts overall in the study. I think it is, in general sense, well done, with the exception of what I pointed out in the beginning about how they group some groups as conservative and some as liberals, and particularly with how things have changed and moved around over that period with the GSS. I do not agree. I do not agree with some of the characterizations there. But overall, I do think it is fair. And a fairly good study. I would most definitely ask, with a bunch of their results, how have a lot of these numbers regarding cognitive ability and support for freedom of speech changed over time, and particularly with some of the ones now, because, like, for example, the group of racists, which can again cross every political spectrum, how has that perception changed, both in how the participants of the survey would have perceived that group ideologically? You know, what would they have perceived as their ideological thing there? And the effective prejudice over time, and the support for freedom of speech. How have those 3 things changed over time? And part of me asked that question because, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, which was after the study was done, after the data from the GSS here was done. So I mean, maybe you can repeat some of the stuff with the GSS part of it, but it's a question I would have is, how has some of these things changed, particularly as in the last 30 years we've had the struggle between the woke, the colloquial woke, if you will, or the postmodernist critical theory, which is effectively a form of Marxism, and the Western Enlightenment tradition have really been butting heads these last few years. And because of that, and particularly because this is a thing that tends to happen with postmodernism. There's lots of attempts to change the meanings of words. And I mean that particularly with some of the things that are in there. And that would be why I would question, how have some of these perceptions changed over time? So how's the effective prejudice changed over time? How's the perception of ideology of a group changed over time? How has the support for freedom of speech changed over time? And how is the cognitive ability how is that relationship with cognitive ability changed over time? Not just in general. They can't necessarily do that with the results that they've got unless they figure it out how to do it from the GSS, which may be possible because the GSS has been running long enough to be actually able to see that over time. How has it changed? And is it really, is it because of some of the changes that we've seen, particularly in the last 30 years, with the input from critical theory being used now in K through 12 and in colleges? That would be the kind of curiosity question that I would have. But overall, I find this really interesting as a study, with some flaws, of course. And the other thing I would question actually is, if you have those two measures of cognitive ability up next to each other and you give them to the same person, do you end up with the same results? Just as a gut check, do you end up with the same results of cognitive ability with the same participants and what have you? If you're putting those, if you're switching between them, because I definitely don't think it's necessarily a good thing to switch between measures of cognitive ability unless they're comparable in a paper. But that's just me satisfying my curiosity there. That's it for now. Until next time, oh yeah, don't forget, after this on Locals, at 8 p.m. Central Time, we'll be chatting a little bit more on this article. And I may do some of the, some of the testing that I was thinking about whilst I'm at it. The thing there, and, yeah, that's it for now. Okay, until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, my friends.